You know that feeling you get scrolling through the news where it just seems like everything is falling apart? Like every headline is another disaster? Well, you are definitely not alone. But a hugely influential book called Factfulness by the late Hans Rosling argues that this feeling is just plain wrong. It's a book that has absolutely captivated millions with its data-driven optimism, but it has also kicked off a pretty intense debate about whether it's telling the whole story. And today, we're diving right into that debate.
And you can totally see why this book was such a breath of fresh air for so many people. I mean, we live in a media landscape that really thrives on negativity, right? And here comes Rosling with a counter-narrative that isn't built on just wishful thinking, it's built on cold, hard data. He makes this incredibly compelling case that, on almost every single key metric, life for the average person on this planet is way better than it has ever been. So here's how we're going to break this all down. First up, we're going to explore Rosling's super hopeful argument. Then, we'll get into why our own brains can so easily mislead us. After that, we'll flip the coin and look at the powerful critiques, the arguments that say the book is painting a dangerously incomplete picture. And finally, we'll try to pull it all together into a worldview that is, well, truly factful.
Okay, so what exactly is this radically hopeful view? Well, at its core, factfulness argues that most of us, and I mean everyone, from regular people all the way up to Nobel laureates, are walking around with a picture of the world in our heads that is dramatically out of date. Rosling's entire mission, his life's work really, was to show us that our perception of global catastrophes, poverty, and disease is just fundamentally skewed. And his weapon of choice? Data.
Right, let's get to the heart of it. Rosling's central message is simple. Step away from the feelings, step away from the headlines, and just look at the facts. He basically pulls decades of public data from huge institutions like the UN and the World Bank, and what this data shows is not small, incremental change, but massive, undeniable improvements in human well-being across the board.
I mean, just look at these numbers. They're staggering. 200 years ago, the average person on Earth lived to be about 30. Today, it's 72. Think about that. The number of kids dying before their first birthday has absolutely plummeted, from 15% down to just 3%. And extreme poverty, which for pretty much all of human history was the default condition for almost everyone, is now under 10%. This isn't just a small bump, this is a total revolution in the human condition.
Okay, now this graph. This is really fascinating because it cuts directly against an instinct we all have. We see disasters on the news 24/7, right? So it feels like the world is a more dangerous place. But the data shows the complete opposite. Just look at that insane drop since the 1930s. Over the last century, thanks to things like better buildings, early warning systems, and global cooperation, we have become incredibly good at surviving what nature throws at us.
So, if things really are getting so much better, why doesn't it feel that way? Well, Rosling argues it's because our brains are basically hardwired with these instincts that were great for survival back on the savannah, reacting super fast to immediate threats. But those same instincts are terrible for understanding slow, gradual global data. Let's look at a really important one. He calls the size instinct.
4.2 million. Just let that number sink in for a second. It's a horrific, gut-wrenching figure. Every single one of those is an unimaginable tragedy for a family. And when you see it presented all by itself like this, the number is just overwhelming. It makes the problem seem impossibly huge, maybe even hopeless.
And this is where Rosling's point just clicks into place. A single, lonely number means almost nothing. Without context, 4.2 million is just a big, scary figure. But put it in context. In 1950, that number was 14.4 million. Wow. Suddenly, that terrible number is also a story of incredible progress. It's the story of over 10 million children's lives being saved every single year. The problem is still bad, yes, but it is also so much better.
Okay, but, and this is a really big but, this is where the story gets a lot more complicated. Because while pretty much nobody disputes Rosling's data, a lot of critics argue that this relentless focus on only the positive trends creates a distorted and maybe even dangerously complacent worldview. They basically claim that factfulness achieves its optimism by cherry-picking the data, by simply not showing you the charts for all the things that are getting worse. And this really is the core question of the whole debate, isn't it? Does celebrating all the amazing progress we've made somehow blind us to the really severe challenges that very same progress has created? Can you really call a worldview factful if it's only looking at one side of the ledger? This quote from one of the most detailed critiques of the book just nails the argument. The point isn't that Rosling's facts are wrong. The point is that he is guilty of what's called selection bias. By choosing to show us only the charts of good things going up and bad things going down, he's presenting a version of reality that, while technically true, is also fundamentally skewed.
All right, so let's dig into what the critics are actually talking about. If we want to build a truly factful worldview, we have to look at the data Rosling chose not to put in the spotlight. So what are the major global trends that are actually actively getting worse?
For example, the book has a graph on the reduction of oil spills, but not on the massive growing mountain of plastic in our oceans. It celebrates declining hunger, but doesn't graph the explosion in global obesity. It highlights how many natural areas are protected, but ignores the staggering, terrifying collapse of biodiversity and wildlife populations. And this is a big one. While it talks about CO2 emissions per person, it doesn't show a graph of total emissions, which is what the planet's climate actually cares about.
Population is another huge battleground in this debate. Rosling makes a really powerful case, based on historical trends, that as health gets better and more children survive, families all over the world naturally choose to have fewer kids, and this trend, he argues, will lead to the world population stabilizing by the end of this century.
But the critics fire back hard on this. They point out that the very same UN projections Rosling uses are way less certain than he makes them sound. According to some analyses, there's only about a 30% chance the population will actually stabilize this century. Everything depends on achieving drops in fertility rates in sub-Saharan Africa that are faster than anything we've ever seen in history. It's a huge challenge, and it is absolutely not a guaranteed thing.
So where does all this leave us? You know, the crucial point here isn't about picking a side. It's not about being an optimist or a pessimist. It's about recognizing that we have two sets of facts that are both true at the exact same time. Human well-being has gotten dramatically better, and the environmental fallout from that improvement is creating some truly existential threats. A truly factful worldview has to be able to hold both of those complicated, messy ideas in its head at once.
So what's the real takeaway here? Well, maybe true factfulness is a kind of five-step process. First, you have to embrace the idea that things can be both bad and better at the same time. Second, just like Rosling taught us, never ever trust a lonely number. Always demand context. Third, yes, we absolutely should celebrate the incredible progress we've made. But fourth, we have to look the negative trends squarely in the eye. And finally, maybe the most important step of all, always be asking yourself, what perspective is missing here? What chart am I not being shown?
Ultimately, this whole debate leaves us with a central, defining question for our time. How do we celebrate our progress without becoming complacent? We have pulled billions of people out of poverty and doubled our lifespans. That is arguably the single greatest achievement in the history of our species. But that very success has put an immense, unprecedented strain on our planet. And the great challenge of our century is figuring out how to protect the incredible gains we've made while solving the profound problems that our own success has created.